Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rosie Baldwin, and I work for Chelsea Green Publishing. And we've been publishing books on the politics and practice of sustainability for over 35 years now. So we are so thrilled to publish Jane Davidson's book, Futuregen, Lessons from a Small Country. And really what's so inspiring about this book is that Jane tells the story of the creation of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And it's really the most groundbreaking legislation we've ever seen, which asks governments to put future generations at the heart of everything they're doing. So it fits incredibly well into the whole Chelsea Green library, and we're very excited to have it out in the world. And first, I just wanted to introduce Tim O'Riordan, who's going to lead the conversation. He's Emeritus Professor of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia, and he is actively involved in research that is addressing the themes around better governance for sustainability. And I think he and Jane actually met when he was Special Advisor to the House of Commons for the Environment Audit Committee. So he's very well placed to understand Parliament and the inner workings of Parliament, and also the importance of the environment and sustainability across government. And just before I hand over to Tim, please, anyone who's listening in, please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, so you can type in your questions, comments, let us know where you're calling in from, and we'll get to that at the end of our conversation. So thank you, and I'll hand over to Tim.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Good evening or good morning or whatever time you are, everyone who's watching. But it's a wonderful privilege for me to talk to Jane and to talk to John. First of all, I've been a tremendous fan of what Jane has been doing in Wales, and an enormous fan of what John has been doing for so many people in the United Kingdom in his wonderfully socially promotive way. He's a remarkable man, and I'm so pleased that I'm part of this discussion. But what we're really beginning to look at is that we're in a world now, and we have been for a long time, but particularly now, where the well-being of the next generation becomes really important to everyone. And we need to find a way in which we can get that concept of well-being, and especially for those who are to come behind us, right up front in terms of policy, delivery, and above all, in actual manifestation that people are genuinely better off at the end of the day. So this is the reason why it's a wonderful chance now for Jane to tell us a bit about herself and about her role in creating what I call a small country with a big heart, Wales, and one of the greatest pieces of legislation that we've ever seen when it comes to making environment and people fit together in a world which is habitable. So Jane, can you give us a little bit of background as to what the Act is about and how you got involved with it, and then I'll invite John to bring his side of the story in following your presentation.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Tim, and I'm delighted to be here having a chance to have a discussion with John about the lessons from the small country of Wales. I mean, the book really, and here it is, writ large, you can see it behind me as well, a bit of product placing for the publishers. The book really tells a story that's not my story. It's a real story of Wales, because the reason that I was able to propose what now is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act actually goes back to before devolution. When Wales was about to get its own National Assembly in 1999, it was civil society in Wales that proposed to Parliament at the time that the Government of Wales Act, the founding constitutional act for the people of Wales and their new National Assembly, should have a duty to promote sustainable development in everything that they did. And this was an incredibly far-sighted proposition. It wasn't there in devolution to Scotland. It wasn't there in devolution to Northern Ireland. So when those of us who came in as the first National Assembly members in 1999, many of us came in not even knowing that this duty was there for us to deliver. But I was privileged to be part of the first government in Wales, in that administration, which took this really seriously. And in fact, It was my old colleagues, Rhodri Morgan, now sadly deceased. Many people know and love Rhodri Morgan in Wales, and Sue Essex, who had been the leader of Cardiff Council, who strongly supported the idea of working with Forum for the Future on looking at what putting sustainable development as a central organising principle for our government would look like. And that was back in the year 2000. So we're talking about a long agenda here, 20 years since we first tried, those of us who were first in the Assembly, to turn this into something meaningful. And I think in many ways, not least because the Assembly itself has grown in power and authority, and of course only this year became a full Parliament with primary legislative powers and the name, the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament. But that journey of the people of Wales has been a journey both about devolution, but also about finding what is the culture of Wales? What is the narrative of Wales? What are the things that Wales needs to deal with, perhaps differently to other parts of the UK? And of course, there are all sorts of things around health, around education, around poverty, about communities left behind because they were the communities that built wealth for others outside Wales, in coal and steel and quarrying and copper and all those sorts of elements. And you think that Wales was there right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and yet many of its communities were left behind as that moved on. And the National Assembly, when it came in 1999, had a clear obligation from all political parties to try and do its best, and that has led to different directions. And that core direction around that promotion of sustainable development turned out to be very hard to deliver. And I and other colleagues, I spent 11 years in government trying to deliver that duty to promote sustainable development. And by the end, I realized that actually a duty is not enough on its own. A duty to promote is certainly not enough on its own. It has to have something tangible about it. People have to know what the duty looks like, and they have to know the processes to achieve it. So when I left politics in 2011, I left a bomb, as one civil servant described it, by saying that what we needed was to have a piece of legislation that was going to enshrine all the principles we've been trying to achieve, but it needed process inside it as well. So now we have a piece of legislation in Wales that, for those who are not familiar with it, lays out 7 goals. Innovative, productive and low carbon society is its prosperous Wales goal, but resilience, health, equality, cohesive communities, vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, and globally responsible. And each of them is outlined in law. And then alongside that, and really importantly, there are a set of processes that people have to think long term. They have to be preventative. They have to integrate their goals so they don't work in silos. They have to be collaborative, have to make sure that they involve those people about whom decisions are being made in those decisions. And the Act went through the Assembly as after me, and therefore I pay such a tribute to all those members of all political parties who picked up this vision and they wanted to create this into legislation. So it's their legislation, even if I might have proposed the basis of it. And of course, their legislation was in discussion with the people of Wales, out there on a major consultation that was called The Wales We Want. And it's those views that went into this. So there is so much evidence that the people of Wales want this type of approach to their lives. And now the challenge is for government, its public services to deliver. And they do so with the help of a Future Generations Commissioner, one of very few who has that role in the world, but Wales is still the only country that has that duty to future generations in law. They do it with the help of the audit function, and they do it with the help potentially of the courts. But the main idea of this is really, let's factor future generations into everything that we do. Because if we don't, they will be poorer, they will find life harder, and it'll be much harder for humans to exist longer term if we don't tackle the challenges in front of us. And so I'm absolutely delighted that Wales picked this up. But I know at the moment there's also lots of interest, not least from John, that we'll hear about in a moment, but from other countries who also are thinking that this COVID moment is perhaps a chance to reset, to think longer term, because we've disenfranchised future generations in politics and policy generally. A future generation is perhaps 25 years. We should be thinking of those longer than that in the context of climate change. But in fact, we make policy for less than 5 years. Sometimes we make policy that doesn't even last a week. And therefore we are disenfranchising those very people who we need to think about in the context of making their lives better. And I'll just finish with a quote from John Rawls, who, the American philosopher, whose theory of intergenerational justice said, "Do unto future generations what you would have had past generations do unto you." So I'm a product of the welfare state. I'm a product of those who thought long term after the war. I think now is the time that we do so again.
Jane, thank you so much. That's a wonderful sense of the power and the perspective of this legislation. One question for you, because it's about ownership. The sense that I got that the Welsh experience involved a lot of people discussing and thinking through, not just what Wales should be like, but how it should be governed and how a piece of legislation this might look in the way in which it's shaped. So there's a kind of ownership, is there, in Wales for the legislation. Is that something that you would like to dwell on? Is that something that's important in the context of making this legislation work? Because it is so generational and so well being driven, these are very ownership oriented things.
Yes, and I think one of the things that I did in the context of the book, and why I hope people will be interested in the book is not just my voice, it's 140 voices. And it's voices from people who have been participating in trying to make it work in Wales, but it's also voices from people from all over the world who'd like to see their countries adopt similar kinds of legislation. It very much became a people's proposal under the Wales We Want, but that was back in 2014. And I think there were some clear lessons that came about from my discussing how the Act is going in Wales at the moment with a range of people. And I think just very clearly, one is that there needs to be real leadership about it. Because if you do something so extraordinary and different, you have to very deliberately lead the proposition as well. So people are looking for real leadership from their leaders of whatever political party in this context. They also, I think that so many people in Wales don't yet know that they have the opportunity to hold their public services and their government to account because of the Act. And I think there's a real opportunity for the Act to actually help government define what a government should be doing with and by and for the people of Wales, not just to the people of Wales, which is what governments historically do. And I think there have to be the right kinds of mechanisms in government. I mean, I think that if I was still in government now, I'd definitely be looking potentially for not only incentivizing, which we're seeing quite substantially in the context of work the government's doing at the moment, particularly around the public sector and procurement and changing the narrative very, very strongly in terms of how they budget as well, and looking at major preventative opportunities. But it's also about learning from others, learning from other countries that may not have got an Act, but might have some fantastic practice that we should be picking up here. So this is a big collaborative, preventative, long-term agenda. A piece of evidence that came out at a seminar I was at this morning from Dr. Alan Netherwood, who's been working on this for many, many years, actually showed that in the first wellbeing plans of the public services in Wales, most of them are not thinking beyond 5 years. And yet, really, we've got to have people thinking 25 years minimum. So there's a way to go, but it's really early. And what's so wonderful is having this conversation, or about to have this conversation with John, who of course is trying to take this forward and adapt it to the UK setting.
Wonderful. It really doesn't give me a sense of perspective for the legislation, Jane, so thank you so much. John, now you're doing an amazingly important job of trying to get this forward. Can you tell us a bit about what has got you going on the well-being and future generations angle? What made you get so interested in it, and why are you championing it so much now?
Well, I created with a number of other people the big issue nearly 30 years ago, and we did it on the basis of helping the homeless to help themselves. We then started to work very, very closely with very, very disturbed people over many, a decade or two. And then we really started to think, well, hang on, we're doing a lot about emergency and coping, but we're not doing anything about prevention, and cure happens almost willy-nilly. So there wasn't any really joined up thinking around going towards preventions, because what we were having was more and more people who needed more and more help. So I and a number of other people in the big issue put together the idea that what we needed to do was to move upstream and move towards prevention. In 2014, I applied to join the House of Lords and actually got in 2016. And I went in when I was asked what I was going in for, and I said very theatrically, to slit the throat of poverty. By that I meant not to make the poor comfortable, as most people seem to be obsessed with, giving them a bit more here and a bit more there, but actually destroy the mechanisms that made poverty become a birthright almost of generation after generation. So I went in for a prevention model. I also realized that even though I was working pretty well outside, and people were saying, John Bird, you're great, you're a great geezer because you think outside the box. And I would always say, well, the only reason I'm thinking outside the box is because the box is not working. And that's why I went into Parliament, because I know that all of the work that we do, if you don't change the laws, and if you don't change the budgeting way, and if you don't change our social security system, then all of this doesn't work. And then having looked around and tried to bring one piece of legislation through, I then realized, of course, that what was happening in Wales was absolutely dynamite, because what they were saying, and it will take a few years to reap all that they have sown, what was really happening, they were presenting it in a different way. They were presenting it as, what we've got to do is, first of all, pass everything through the prism of future generations. And that I found so exciting. I then contacted the people down there, the commissioner, Sophie House. I then went down and talked and spoke at some of their events. And I realized that the Welsh legislation was probably, as you have said just now, some of the most beautiful legislation ever put together, because it is about not allowing another generation of big issue vendors, or another generation of rough sleepers, or another generation who have failed, like the 35% of children that we fail at school at the moment, who become our underclass, who fill up our prisons and our A&E departments, and become the people who have all the working poor jobs or are long-term unemployed. And this, in my opinion, when the Welsh Act really bites in, because you've got to convince a load of politicians and practitioners that you need to move in a much deeper way. I think if it happens, and if it happens the way it is happening, I think we're going to have some really beautiful changes, and those beautiful changes need to be throughout the UK. And we're using Wales as an example. I started with prevention. I've now moved on. We are now working on how do we, our future, the well-being of future generations obviously has to start now. So one of the things that we're doing now is starting a ride out recession alliance, which we're doing with people like Shelter and Unilever, and we're bringing in the big players and not so big to try and make sure that tomorrow is not destroyed by today, so that we don't want tomorrow, the future generations walking on the dead of the COVID-19 poverty crisis of today. And if we don't watch out, we're going to have a few million people who are prospectively evicted and made homeless. So we've really got to work on that. So that is really sorting out today for tomorrow. We've got the bill going through the House. It passes. The next time we kick it into place is in November. I can never remember the stages. Is it a committee or is it something else? But my lads and lasses know that better than me. But that's what's drawn me to it. Prevention, creating new generations. I don't want the next generation to suffer the kind of ugliness of thinking that has gone into often the well-intentioned legislation of today.
John, the debate that we're beginning to have in the COVID scene is that already it is showing that mental health is becoming a significant issue. It's showing that child poverty is increasing. It's showing that domestic abuse is becoming much greater. All the signs of what you call social insecurity are becoming greater. Do you think this gives your bill a greater opportunity for getting recognition, because we're really potentially going into desperate straits for large numbers of people? Your image of people walking on the backs of those who already suffered is a very powerful one. What would you say? Can we capitalize on the world that we're in right now to make your vision more likely?
I think we can, but I think one of the things that political commentators and politicians are going to really have to do is realize that the future is only going to be done as an amalgam of opposites. It's not going to be done by one political persuasion or others. And I think we're going to have to stop the kind of, stop the point scoring, the hectoring. We're going to really have to have a unity of thinking. We use the word coalition in this term. Unfortunately, the last coalition nearly killed us. So we don't want to go down that road. But we do need to have collaborative and collegiate thinking. And there is enormous opportunities, as the community has proved to us, that the community can come together, helping some of the most disenfranchised people in the community. And one of the things I really was so happy about, as an ex-road sweeper, as an ex-dustman, as an ex-hospital cleaner, as an ex-washer-up, I was so pleased to see that people were clapping the people who are overlooked. So if we can keep that spirit where we include the drivers and everybody else who keeps the machinery of life going, then I think we've got something to look forward to. But I do think, as you remember all the Cummings chasing and all the slagging off of Boris, it's incredible that we're slagging off the person who won the election, and we unfortunately are lumbered with this guy, and we can't change leader in midstream. There's nobody else there. And what we have to do is really learn to sup with the devil. I've learned to sup with the devil, but I think that collaborative thing is forgetting about all the wrongs of the past and saying the future is now coming swiftly before us. So if we can get through all of this kind of point scoring, I mean, if you've got millions of, I think it's about 1 million households. If you've got 1 million households who are likely to be evicted in the next 3 to 6 months, you've got an enormous crisis. And that is what needs to be worked on, not scoring points from your party political posture. And I would say that one of the beauties of the Welsh system is that the Welsh, the work that was done in the assembly was transitional across all of the parties, and it was so inclusive and so beautiful.
Don, thank you. I think it's actually helpful if we stress this, and again for the viewers also to understand that this is ultimately not only a cross-party issue, it's not a political issue, because it is across generations, and by definition parties will change And parties need, I think, to think much more collectively and creatively that the future generations really are important in their own right. But Jane, going back to you, because I think this is relevant to this discussion, is the extent to which the notion of well-being may take over the notion of the definition of prosperity and wealth, of some kind of goodness and betterment for people. Because I noticed that the Mori Ipsos poll is giving a high profile, people are giving a high profile notion of well-being and away from just a narrow notion of money in the pocket wealth. Would you like to take this a bit further on that? Because I think John will also follow up as well, that we're maybe shifting our ground as a nation and well-being is becoming a center of gravity for defining progress and betterment.
No, that's really interesting as a proposition. I think what I've very much noticed throughout my political life is that terms which, if you think as a scientist, for example, in the context of the changing climate, you can see as a factual issue, you can measure it, you can quantify it, you can report on it, you can share the information with others. But if they're unpalatable to the extent that climate change is, they then become contested political territory. So you end up in a situation where the very phrase puts people on one side or other of the debate. And actually that is on a cross-party basis as well. And I think that one of the things that it's really important to do if you take a more collegiate approach to politics is to actually try and find the language that enables people to mobilize around an idea. And whereas, you know, issues around climate are clearly contested, I do hope, and this is why I do hope that, you know, there is a moment that could potentially become a movement, and we can see that John's movement, Today for Tomorrow, is growing exponentially and has done so during COVID. And if you're watching this, please look at Today for Tomorrow in terms of taking that forward. But we know that the idea of being a good ancestor or looking after future generations is something that's in the interests of us personally. It's in the interests of us at community level, it's in the interests of us as a nation, and it's in the interest of us as global citizens. So there is an ownership potentially around that. And then, of course, well-being is becoming very important in a situation where so many people are at risk of loss of livelihood, are struggling with issues around mental health, are struggling in poor accommodation, are struggling with homelessness. And we know that in all these areas, you know, the very issues that I came into politics to try and address back in the early 1980s, they have got worse. And we have seen a whole generation of people whose rights have been reduced, whose opportunities have been reduced. And that's particularly noticeable for those of us who came from that from that post-war generation, when people thought there should be a national health service, there should be national education offer, there should be national housing. Essentially, that all those essential elements which humans at their most vulnerable need, clean air, clean water, energy, food, safety, that it was government's duty to provide. And in my politics, that's where government's duty lies, not in Trident, for example. It lies in making sure that its population is safe and secure and able to undertake education and get chances in life as a result. So I think that when we then see that this current generation, the generation that our children are in, is one that has the largest university debts, are least able to buy houses, are unfortunately, in the context of COVID, those people on their first job or coming out of university may not find jobs in the immediate future. And we know that those chances are being lost, and they're not lost by those people. So if we're going to focus on future generations, and if we're going to focus on how to help those future generations from in my view, the proper role of government, the safety and security of the nation, then in fact there needs to be very clear government commitment to looking after not this generation, but the ones further down the line as well. And I think what's really important about as well about the point that John made about collegiality is that if you make a piece of legislation that is only associated with one political party, every time you get an election, the next party comes in and sees that one of the first jobs it's going to do is repeal that legislation. And yet we would hope that in the context of future generations, we would hope that because there was not full support, but strong cross-party support in the Senedd in terms of passing the Act, because actually, when I was leading on the agenda, I did so with the full support of Plaid Cymru, our coalition partners, in terms of creating the policy that has been turned into the well-being of future generations. We called it One Wales, One Planet at the time. So it was that coalition that enabled us to move forward. And that coalition then went forward on a multi-party basis to see the election through. But well-being is about a society at peace with itself. You cannot be at peace with yourself as a society if you are disenfranchising most people in it. And the shocking statistics, I had a meeting earlier today on food, were that because of universal credit, my local food bank, what the local food bank did in our local community increased by 50% because of universal credit. It then increased by 80% because of COVID. There is a huge underlying problem at the moment that needs to be addressed by any government interested in future generations. Otherwise, you repeat the problems of the past, which means that you do not enable people to live safe lives in this society and go on to actually be able to appreciate and benefit from education or anything else. So when people say education is a route out of poverty, that is actually about what contributes to our well-being, what contributes to our being able to be free to do what we can to serve. And there's been some comments in the chat about, you know, is this sort of the liberal middle class elite? And I know that I grew up in that, but I also know that John didn't. And John has described categorically that we've come from entirely different places to realise that actually not just this country, but any country would benefit from this kind of approach to legislation.
Thank you. That's wonderful. You really made it very clear, your kind of vision, but also how relevant it is to today and the post-COVID appearance that's coming our way. John, setting up the legislation as you're trying to do, and hopefully you will achieve over the next period of time, what are the hallmarks of the legislation you're trying to put across into the House of Parliament and eventually the House of Commons that will make this act a strong act for England? What, so that viewers and listeners can hear, what would you be looking for by the achievement of this act if it comes through?
Can you hear me?
You? John, we need you.
Oh, yeah, sorry, no. Can you hear me?
Yes, could you hear my question, John?
I didn't hear all of it, sorry, forgive me.
I'm just asking, what are you looking for in the successful legislation you're seeking to achieve in the House of Lords and through that to the House of Commons? What would be the hallmark of it from your point of view?
Well, the hallmark, I suppose, because I come at it from slightly, I mean, I've got to make this as general as possible. I have to win friends of left, right, and centre. So what we're trying very, very hard to do is meet points that we can unite around. And I think the poverty agenda is a very, very good place for us to start with. So what we've been doing is kind of drumming up the people who have appreciated the work that we've done before, and the fact that we are now moving inexorably towards prevention, and we're not simply We've got to stop the flow of people slipping into poverty. So the real hallmarks for us are around the poverty agenda, which is around how do we stop child poverty? How do we hit food justice? How do we hit the fact that many people have failed school? So it's those are the kind of general things. What I think brings us into the future generation is that it enables, will this legislation affect improve the chances of another generation getting proper education, getting proper nutrition? What are we going to do about the fact that the poorer you are, the more likely you are to have a nutritional shortage? 40% of my local hospital and many are full of questions around, questions around nutritional lacking nutritional. So what we're doing is we're working very much around friends. So that to us is that we're broadening it, because one of our partners is Caroline Lucas, who is adding very much the kind of environmental issues around the social justice issues around environmentalism. And so we're taking it in a number of ways. I would personally like to think that, because I'm that kind of nutter, I believe if you get rid of poverty, you get rid of 70% of legislation anyway, because most legislation is often a response to the problems thrown up by poverty. 70% of the work that the House of Lords and the House of Commons actually handles, 70% of it is to do with the echoes, the social echoes, the collateral damage of poverty, whether that's crime, whether that's nutrition, whether that's a hit on the NHS. The NHS, as we know, is the largest social sponge in Britain for sopping up all of the contradictions thrown up by poverty. So there are all these kind of situations. But I would say, because we come at it from the poverty angle, I think that means that we have managed to win a very large sway of support, left, right and centre, because I think most people are really cheesed off with the amount of youth, young people going to school without proper food, the quality of the education they're given, the quality of the social support. So it's those kind of issues that I think we're best suited to handle and to kind of knock into. Sorry, I lost my place there because everything went down for a bit.
Well, I think you're making John, you're making a very powerful point, which needs to be reinforced. That a lot of our costs in our modern society are the product of injustice, abuse, and poverty. We're paying huge amounts of effort in education, in crime prevention, in domestic abuse, all kinds of issues associated with homelessness. All these things are costly. And they're costly because we're not doing the preventative side that you've been championing in this legislation. So I think you're making a very good point that we are actually turning circles in such a way. Without this act, we're going to become more and more spending money and having more and more problem cases to deal with. This is the way I'm getting your message very clearly. So we've got to turn this around in a completely new way and start investing in stopping these things from happening. Have I got it? Have you heard me? Have I got that right for you?
I've heard you. You got me dead right. Thank you very much. And I would just tell you the ridiculous chat that I had in 2007 or 8 with the new leader of the Conservative Party, Mr. Cameron, when I asked him to tell me how much it cost for him to produce the person, this person able to run the Conservative Party, and all the, the university and all those going out shooting clay pigeons on the moor in those green jackets, those up, the the four-wheel drives and all that kind of stuff. I asked him, and I said it probably cost about $350,000 to produce you here today. And he said, no, it's about $250,000. And I said, you know, 10 years ago, I said, we've just done a survey of our big issue vendors. And you know, on average, 80% of them had been in local authority care for over 10 years. And that was really a terrible situation. Those 10 people cost over £1 million to turn into a big issue vendor. The cost of poverty is enormous. If we, for instance, now allow this next generation through COVID-19 poverty to slip into homelessness, the costs of not keeping them in their home will double and treble, and it will be moved down the line. So it's so interesting that, as I said, I think poverty is virtually, you can sort out all the other issues that are most pressing in our society.
Well, John and Jane, I've been looking at the questions coming in, so we're going to have a little bit of a session. And Rosie, I can actually handle the questions. There's enough of them that I can handle. They're not too many, and they're very pertinent. The two questions for you, Jane, we'll start with from the viewing friends that we've got here. One is, can you give any example of how a policy in Wales has been changed as a result of the Act? And secondly, what do you think the Act still needs to do to be even more effective in terms of your vision? That's a coupling of questions which I think you can handle very easily.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that it would be quite useful to say something about the Wales direction of travel over the years as well, because people won't necessarily realise that Wales was the first country in the UK to put a charge on carrier bags, which is something I was able to do as minister, and then within 4 years was followed up in slightly different ways by all parts of the UK. People won't necessarily realise that Wales was the first to have a children's commissioner, something else that was followed up in all parts of the UK. And since the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act has been in place, Wales has also banned smacking. So that you can see a direction of travel that depended on the amount of authority that the Welsh Government and the National Assembly, now the Senedd, had. And that's really important because, funnily enough, it was Wales that wanted to be the first to outlaw smoking in public places, because Wales had a disproportionately large number of deaths related to smoking and did not have the powers to do so. But now that Wales has the powers, I think that example of the smacking ban, example of the introducing the opportunity for young people of 16 to 18-year-olds to vote in elections, setting up a youth parliament, pupil councils, youth councils, part of a kind of large agenda of young people getting involved. And of course, our own Future Generations Commissioner has a Young Leaders Academy of young people from all the public service organisations, looking at how far they can take the Act. Both the Parliament and the government have declared a climate emergency, and that is being worked on at the moment. Projects that I've been involved in are about completely changing the procurement system. I mean, it's something I've wanted to do for years, and so many people have tried to do it, but actually now ensuring that procurement delivers on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And in one part of Wales that I was working in with my university hat on last year, were given £100,000 by the Welsh Government to look at a foundational economy approach, how we could use the public plate, all the public organisations working together, which they're required to do by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, to use local produce, support local producers, and give new opportunities to new food systems that were sustainable. And by doing that, therefore creating opportunities for new jobs as well. mean, Wales is up with the best in the world in terms of recycling and heading to zero waste by 2050, and is still on target. Well, perhaps not with the COVID plastic waste, but, you know, has generally been on target to achieve those outcomes by 2025. So there's a lot of, if you think about the kind of things that Wales has legislated for since it legislated for the Act. Remember, the Act was only legislated for 5 years ago. It only came into force in 2016. In the first couple of years, public services had to define their plans. So it's only really starting now. And I think the test will be how the parties interpret the Act in the context of the next election, and the big opportunities they have to use the Act to act in the interests of Wales and not in the interests of any other part of the UK. And that's not about being different for the sake of it. It's about being confident that the Act gives the permission to think sustainably in the context of Wales. And I just finished by saying that I think one of the most important things about law, as opposed to policy, is that it is enduring. And it does not stop any party from having an ideology around how they want to deliver, provided they factor in future generations, which in itself changes their decision making. And I think that is the most exciting part of this, so that you might get a party that believed in individual responsibility, looking a lot more at how it might build new small or medium-sized businesses that were going to deliver on these opportunities in the private sector. You might get another party that wants to tackle the very issues that John wants to has just mentioned, about how you look after the most vulnerable, because the costs of keeping a child in care in local authority and giving them worse outcomes are probably far greater than any of the rest of us at this table now in bringing us up in environments that were supportive. So how do we create the most supportive environment for our citizens, keep them safe, and do so in a way that makes sure that we don't make the problem worse in the context of climate change or nature degradation? And we could do it because we have, in many ways, we have the technologies, but we don't necessarily have the will. What is our will, for example, to keep fossil fuels in the ground and create a total green recovery in creating jobs that will not add to the problem, but add to the solution, and therefore upskill a whole new generation of young people into jobs that will actually be there and needed for now, for the next decade and more, in terms of transforming Welsh society, Welsh housing, Welsh food systems, Welsh health systems, tackling air pollution in ways that deliver well-being for us all.
Wonderful, very inspiring, Jane, I have to say. John, there's a couple of very interesting questions for you, and I'll paraphrase them to help you. One is, how are you going to get the constituency with which you are most concerned actively engaged in shaping this legislation? Is that something that you're working on? Is that possible? And can we get what we might call the green liberal middle class to align themselves with the constituency of poverty? Not that they don't have a sense and very great feeling of it, but it's that close working empathy. Do you think that that kind of multiple constituency can be formed and forged to make this legislation drive through on a multi-party basis? What's your view on that?
Well, I think there's there is the parliamentary activity that you know, that we're preparing and going through and winning the hearts and minds of both houses. So that's have appointed a campaign manager, somebody who will be starting in the middle of August and will be leading a campaign into communities and into businesses and into the third sector. Obviously, we've got to keep the lads and the lasses happy in Parliament, so we've got to that they are being disenfranchised, the laws, if we could put opportunity of behaving today. We've had a few people who said that. But the other way, you talk about the how do we enjoy, I mean, somebody's asked a question, how do we bring in the disenfranchised to the argument? Well, one of the ways we bring the disenfranchised in is to move them out of disenfranchisement, to move them into enfranchisement, which is about homes, which is about improving their abilities to operate in society, to be able to make choices in their own lives. So that is a very, very long process that that has to be taken into bringing people into that argument. Can I tell you that if you talk to the average big issue vendor about the future generations, those people who know about it, they're already vociferous and wanting to be involved in it. Our movement that we're building around the Parliament does not exclude any groups of people in the community. So we will, but I mean, I've spoken in prisons about this. I've spoken in hospitals about this. I've spoken in the City of London about this, in big financial institutions. And it is that idea of bringing them all together. I'm very, very interested, being an ex-offender myself, I'm very, very interested in putting future generations onto the curriculum of some of the prisons that are that are responding to our needs to educate people while they're banged up. So when they get out, they're not further behind than when they first went in. Their skills increased. But the only way of bringing in the disenfranchised is to move them out of disenfranchisement. I'm not interested in making them comfortable outside. I want them to move forward and to participate in the democracy that we operate under. However full, limited and shallow at times our democracy is, if you live in poverty, I assure you, you don't live anywhere near democracy. So that's a kind of one of the points. I think the other thing that I was very interested, I went to the founding, I think the Welsh Green Party. We launched this thing at the our future well-being of future generations. We launched it at the Welsh Green Party in Newport. Their conference last year, and what I did was I took three people there, two of my own children and somebody else, and I put them in a T-shirt, and the T-shirt said, "I'm a Greenan." And what I was trying to do was to try and say, why don't we as a society start participating in cleaning up our community, not leaving it to others? Why don't we start the idea of environmentalism with two children on the third? Why do we, and one of the ways that, of course, is by cleaning up the environment for the underclass, as it often is. This isn't litter picking just to make yourself feel good. This is about bringing environmentalism right into people's lives so that they can say, oh, so that is what environmentalism. So I'm very interested in that idea, but I'm also very interested in going to public schools, going to prisons, and going and telling them about the social and the environmental improvements that will come from a future generations that passes through the work that was being done in Wales and continues to be done.
Very lovely
Hello?
answer, and very powerful. Look, we're just about coming to the end of this, but there's one final question for both of you, which is in a sense also to give you a chance to say anything else or wrap up what you really want, message you want the viewers to take home. And that is, do we actually need a social movement for this particular piece of legislation, rather than a party political or even a multi-party political initiative. The sense I'm getting, this is a people's system, an ownership system. It's not a political one. And I was wondering whether you can throw some light on that. And John, in the light of what you've just said, whether you'd like to take that further, since you're spearheading this legislation right now. Jane, what would you say about that? A kind of movement-driven, people's-orientated charge?
Well, I think what's absolutely fascinating about that, and I've seen the question in the chat from Rowan, who works with Parents for Future UK and Global on this, is it was civil society that led this in Wales. And in a sense, I suppose I was the super willing, but also incredibly stroppy politician who picked it up and wasn't prepared to give up when people kept saying no. So, but it was civil society, and it still is civil society. So that although the act is there, it is civil society that's encouraging the Senedd and the government to do better. It is civil society that wants Wales to deliver on this, because civil society is very proud that Wales has this act. But I think there's the gap now is that civil society in the context of the people who work in the charities, who work in the organisations, who are engaged in the policy and the political debates in Wales. What I absolutely agree with what John was saying was that if I go somewhere and I tell people from all walks of life that we have this legislation, most people know nothing about it. And they're absolutely delighted to find they have it. And then, well, how can we use it? And they definitely want to use it to hold their government and public services to account. So, of course, in a way, you've got this position where, is it, a brave government would ensure that the people were fully informed. It would be in schools. People would understand this as part of the Welsh constitution and consciousness, in order to ensure that people were enfranchised to hold their government and public services to account. And I hope that that's what will happen in the context of the next Senedd elections next year. I hope the parties are brave enough to say, we will be asking the people of Wales how they want to hold us to account in this context. So the role of civil society, particularly in a small country, is critical. I also want to pick up on John's point about environmentalism, because I haven't emphasized it in what I've been saying so far. But when we're talking about the very basis of human survival in terms of clean air, clean water, food, this is all about having a healthy planet as well as healthy people. And we can't have a healthy planet if we carry on behaving as we do. So actually, a key element in my learning was that nature is not just for those people who like nature or who study nature or who want to protect the environment. Keeping nature in a good state is an absolutely fundamental matter for us all. I understand the UN now calls it a foundational value, and it is absolutely at the heart of all our futures. So I was particularly delighted, and so it's an example I didn't use, but it's an example I think that's quite cogent with people, that one of the first acts that happened after the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act was passed was that the First Minister of Wales did not accept the independent expert's planning recommendation to put in place several miles of motorway on the M4 in southeast Wales because of the environmental damage that would cause. Now, people argued, I think probably correctly, that was not down to the act itself, but it was down to the difference in thinking. And the First Minister is very clear about that. He did not believe that we should trade off the environment for short-term gain, particularly when that gain was road building, when what we should be doing is looking at alternative ways of transportation that are carbon emission free or dramatically reduced. And only yesterday, the minister made a statement in the Senedd about the fact that over the next 3 years, we will see a 20-mile-per-hour limit in every residential area in Wales. And that will contribute towards active travel, and that will contribute towards walking and cycling. The town next to me, Cardigan, this year for the first time has pedestrianised its town centre. And it's not an easy town centre to pedestrianise in any way whatsoever, using the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And everywhere across Wales, we're seeing new opportunities pop up where councils now feel enfranchised to use the Act to do some of the things they might have wanted to do already. So I think that we'll see over the next few years a range of propositions, but in many ways, the one I find most exciting, and I think plays to everything that, that Tim, you and John, you've been saying here this evening, is actually a project called Skyline. And all these are outlined in my book, and the contributions from others about what they want to see from the Act. And that Skyline project is about communities in the South Wales valleys that were left behind by coal, have had money thrown at them in exactly the same way as John describes in care homes. They've had so much money thrown at them in government doing things to them. And now, for the first time, using the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, those communities are going to have their land handed to them in perpetuity in terms of actually transforming their local economy and environment. If that comes to fruition, and everything I've wanted to see in terms of communities themselves holding governments to account, calling on public services to support them, will actually generate the Wales I want and reflect the Wales we wanted when we all responded in 2014. So the book is here. The book is a narrative telling you how well it's going, how badly it's going, what is going on, but it opens you up to a world of opportunity. So I do hope people will read it. And thank you.
Wonderful. You get a great statement about why this act is vital. It's not just necessary, it's vital. John, you are a great champion of this. What are your final thoughts? Mobilization and necessity and so on. How would you like to wrap this up tonight? Because it's been a wonderful conversation. I'm so impressed and so delighted with it.
I'm very optimistic. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm trying to get you to give us a sense of where you're at now and what you want to see happen now. I mean, this hope that's coming from what Jane has said for your own, not just your bill, what you believe in as a person you've given your life to over the last 20 or 30 years.
I believe in the socialization of capital. I believe in the socialization of our spaces and our cities. I don't believe in the mockery that we've often gone through, where we've had a local authority ride roughshod over the concerns of local people. So I'm really glad that the Future Generations Bill will extend democracy into the lives of everybody. I would just like also to make a point that it's interesting that we have recently passed through, not just if Black Lives Matter should teach us anything, and that is that the past will come to bite us. And it is a very, very clear demonstration of what Shermism was like in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and well into the 19th century. Short-termism is a killer, and that is why it's so important that we move forward to this long-term debate of where do we want to be, what are the values, and that to me is a social thing. It is not a political in the party political sense. I am really happy that a lot of the people I've worked with around the COVID-19 crisis have come from left, right, center, and I would like to see that uniformity, that alliance to carry on. I believe it's an extra parliamentary thing as much as a parliamentary thing. We can change the laws, but we've got to change the way that we think about the future, because we cannot make tomorrow a repeat of today or yesterday.
Well, you two have done something quite remarkable, and I'm just going to ask Rosie, I want you to not to summarize, because it's not fair to summarize, but I think what I'm saying, what I would like to say to both of you is you've shown us why this act is absolutely essential. You've shown us that without this act, we're going to be very impoverished in a variety of ways, not just in terms of money, but in terms of ideology and values. And without this act, we're going to become a society which is increasingly lost its soul. And I feel that you have shown us that this act is something that we just have now to mobilize and create. And I think that the people of Britain, in their variety of ways, and particularly the younger generations of this country, are looking for something now that will give them not only hope, but a purpose, and they'll be listened to because they'll be respected. And if they're not respected, then we're not going to get the response that we need. So I think you, both of you in your wonderful ways and wonderful presentations, give us a sense of the significance and criticality of this legislation and why it is so urgently needed and so desperately required at this very great time of our transformational state in the United Kingdom and indeed globally. So Rosie, I'm delighted with what's happened today, and I think we've been blessed by our two speakers. So thank you very much for organizing this, and maybe you'd like to give us a final wrap up on what has been a really great event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you for leading the conversation. It's been fascinating, and it's so great to hear from Lord Bird about what's happening in the UK as well, because I think what's so inspiring about this book is that we see the legislation and the Futuregen Act that came from Wales being implemented in different ways around the world. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Jane, Lord Bird, and Tim. And this conversation is being recorded, and we will have it available on the Chelsea Green Publishing YouTube channel in a few days. So have a good night, everyone, and thanks for joining.